Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Get Into It with Gila. I'm Gila Glassberg, your host, registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor. And today I have Talia Becker on for the second time. Thanks for coming back on.
Oh, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Sure. I'm so excited to have you on again and to talk about my favorite topic, intuitive eating.
Mm-hmm.
So, so let's just begin, I guess, with last time when you were on, we were talking about eating disorders,
Yeah.
and now we're talking about intuitive eating. So I think people maybe think that intuitive eating is a way to heal an eating disorder, or you can use it as a modality of treatment. And I think that's a misconception. So how about you talk about that a little bit? Why intuitive eating isn't something that can heal an eating disorder, but it's the ultimate goal after recovery.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So when someone, whether they come in for treatment, whether they're on the unit or private practice, whatever it is, a lot of times people who engage in eating disorders, their hunger cues are very much off because either they've been hungry and they don't listen, or they're not hungry and they're overeating. So like your body kind of goes haywire. So for those people, we really want to retrain the body how to develop those hunger cues. So we really start with specific times. So like, okay, so breakfast at 8, a snack at 10:30, lunch at 12, whatever time frame works for you. And then over time, the body's like, oh, hey, it's like 10:30 snack time. We're hungry because your body's so used to eating at those intervals. So initially, when we start, you try to find times that work for you in terms of eating. And then also, a registered dietitian helps you figure out what you need nutritionally. So, a protein, a carb, a vegetable, a fruit, whatever it is, they work it out in your meal plan because you want to make sure you're getting all food groups. And also, when you're in recovery with your hunger cues, you also don't really know what you're in the mood for. You want sweet, you want salty, you want this, you want that, but you also need to make sure you're getting in enough nutrients. The dietitian will help you with that. So, at each meal, you're going to have specific food items that meets all the food groups. And again, you may not be hungry, you may not be wanting it, but part of recovery is that you need either to get on a better food schedule, you need to nourish yourself. And the only way that's going to happen initially is if you nourish yourself in that way by having all those food groups and eating at specific times. That's the initial goal. However, as time goes on, right, and we're not robots, a craving may pop up, right? Oh, I'm suddenly in the mood for like something sweet. I'm suddenly in the mood for something salty. And let's say you were planning on having waffles for breakfast and now you want something salty, you want an omelet. So maybe in the meal plan before you were kind of set to have X, Y, and Z. Whereas over time with intuitive eating, you can say, okay, I'm going to do this instead. Or I'm just in the mood for, a chocolate bar right now. And with intuitive eating, that is something that you can do. So I think the initial goal is to have a more like set sort of meal plan with the dietitian. And over time, you want to get into intuitive eating and you want to be able to listen to your body and fullness. But again, intuitive eating is more complicated than that. Even if you're full and you want something after that because you want to, I don't know, you have a craving, that's also very okay. But many patients, after we get past the initial meal plan stage, are like, well, intuitive eating, you're just telling me that I'm allowed to have a box of donuts. You're telling me I can eat the whole box of cereal, which, nope, I never said that. But I
Mhm.
think we need some clarification from an intuitive eating dietitian on what that next stage looks like and what is intuitive eating. Is it just opening a box of donuts and eating 12 donuts and opening a gallon of ice cream and eating a gallon of ice cream? Or is there some other gray area where it's not so black and white? And I feel like Gila, as the intuitive eating guru, I think would be helpful for you to shed some light on that, if that's okay.
Sure. So yeah, I think it is really important that people know that you can't use intuitive eating to like in the initial stages of eating disorder recovery. Um, yeah, and it's actually an interesting thing that you said about like not really hearing your hunger cues and not really hearing your fullness cues, because like I always say this to clients that like because dieting tells you what to eat, when to eat, how much to eat, you really maybe aren't getting hunger fullness cues. So like let's say if the diet says like you should be hungry now, I know like on OA, people have to like they have to weigh and measure their food and they have to eat that amount, even if they're getting a fullness cue. And they're just like, yeah, like it's hard for me to stop eating because like I'm so used to just eating my whole plate. And that's an external cue telling you when you should be full. And I think it goes even further um into like we don't really have body trust in general. I was just saying this to a client
Mm-hmm.
that like I know I've heard a lot of therapists talk about this on Instagram, which I know that's funny, but like I really, really, really think this is like so smart that like I think back in the day, let's say like somebody went to visit family and like their great uncle was like, come sit on my lap, and the child was like, I don't want to, and then the parent was like, oh, it's rude. And you totally just like turned off that child's like internal compass of like, I don't feel comfortable with that person. So I know that's not the same thing, but it's a very similar thing of like body trust that we want to like cultivate in ourselves, cultivate in our children. So it makes sense that somebody who's healing from an eating disorder wouldn't be able to use um, intuitive eating. But yes, as we transition, intuitive eating is definitely a modality that I think could help anybody. And I always say like the principles of intuitive eating can be used in other areas of life. I really like to try to help clients figure that out also. So, but I guess what the hardest part about intuitive eating is that there are 10 principles, so that it's kind of hard to say that this is intuitive eating when
Right.
there's 10 principles, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. That makes sense.
Yeah. So I've kind of like, I always say this, like I've kind of like developed a way to go through the principles kind of. And obviously every client's different, but I feel like this way kind of helps people realize that it's like every principle kind of builds on each other.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to go in any specific order, but there's a usual way that makes sense to most people that I've seen. And sometimes I see they're going a different way, and sometimes, okay, so let me tell you what I mean. So there's 10 principles of intuitive eating. The first principle is reject diet mentality.
Which I think for so many and so many of our patients who we work with, that is really hard. And that's a
Right,
huge one, especially if you've grown up, your parents, your siblings, your friends, like family, like that one is so hard to reject because like a lot of my patients say, well, if I reject that, I don't fit in with my family. I don't relate to my
right,
family. So
right,
how do you deal with that when someone comes in and is like reject diet culture? Like I have to reject
right,
my entire lifestyle. Like, what is that like?
right. That is really sad, but that's true. So I guess like clients get to know, like I get to know my clients and they get to know me, that like a lot of what I do is like value-based living, right? So like I like to think of like the spectrum of eating disorders, and I always quote Jessica Setnick when I say this, that like people have to think about food, right? So let's say 25 to 40% of the day you have to think about food. What am I going to eat? I'm going to go to the grocery store, right? That's normal human behavior. Um, and let's say disordered eating is like thinking about food 40 to 80% of your day, and which is like a lot.
Right.
Um, but like an eating disorder is like 80 to 110% of your
Right.
day, because you're
Oh,
even like dreaming about food because you're so
hmm.
calorically deprived. Even on the binging side, you're so involved in food as a coping mechanism.
Right.
So that makes sense, right?
Absolutely.
So I always say like, I guess like I am a dietitian and I really want to stay within my scope, but I always just say that like you want to look at your life as like, let's say like a pie chart, and think like, let's say I'll use my life as an example. So I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I'm a Jew, not in any specific order. I'm a I'm
No
a
one's
business.
judging.
Yeah, I have 8 siblings. I have
Wow.
I have my husband has 3 siblings and they're all married, right? So all my siblings and siblings-in-laws. I have friends. I have so much, thank God, in my life, right? If food was taking up like 40 to 80% of that pie chart, my life would be very small. My life would feel very small.
Which is interesting that you say that because I think, like, from the therapist perspective, right? That's the point. Like, what are you not thinking about that you're thinking about food so much? Is it trauma?
Hmm.
Is it anxiety? Is it
Right,
perfectionism? Is it
right,
all these things? So, like you said, it's like it's so important to figure out what are you trying to avoid potentially that you're
right,
thinking about this so much. And yeah, can you imagine if you take away that 80 to 100%? Like, whoa. I always say, like, there, a lot of patients say to me, like, that's so scary. Like, what will I do? I'm like, why do you reframe it as, like, what opportunities will you have? And, like,
right.
all this mental capacity to just live a life that you want to, not what your eating disorder wants to do.
Even like I would take it a step further, that like I guess a painful part of adulthood, which I always say like as adults, like we're not victims, so we get to choose, which is like really hard.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where I heard this, but I think it was actually Faggy Pollock. So shout out to her. She's like a EFT practitioner. She was also on the podcast.
Mhm.
I like to think of like adulthood as like a drawer that has like our junk drawer that has lots and lots of stuff in it. Not junk like candy, like junk like
All right.
and
Tchotchkes.
yeah, tchotchkes. So like as kids, like we just absorb like messages and that's just how it is by osmosis, right? And then as
Yeah.
adults, we like take the contents of the drawer and we dump it out on a desk and we would say like this I like and this I don't like, right? So let's say like our whole family is a dieting family. Our whole family believes like if you're thin, you're beautiful and you're good and you get a lot of attention. And let's say you have I mean, I have a huge family, thank God.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't have that. My whole family is obsessed with dieting, thank God. So I'm just trying, I know a bit from clients and I'm trying to think like I go to like a Hanukkah party or I go to like a, Sukkot meal. And it's like, let's say a lot of my clients do have also very big families and the whole meal is about dieting. Now, like, take a step back and think about what the meal really represents as like, let's just say Hanukkah or
For
Sukkot, right?
sure.
Or
Yeah.
Thanksgiving or Christmas even. Like this meal here is representing like my family, my religion, my freedom, and 80% of the meal is about who lost weight, who did bariatric surgery, who's skinny, who like yeah, I can't help but think there's some level of avoidance, right?
For sure. For sure. It really does take away from so much. And like, right, the point is to like be with family and enjoy and
Right.
with other people. And it's hard also because for some people they can talk about it and it can roll off their shoulders, but the people who are like struggling the most, it
Right.
get triggered the most. So it's not
Right.
just like, oh, that diet. For them, it's like, oh no, do I need to be on that diet? Are they talking
Right.
about me? Like, am I doing something bad or
Right.
different? Like, there's so many layers to that.
Right. I've heard that like across the spectrum, like people who are really working on rejecting the diet mentality and then they go to a family gathering and they're talking about like their latest diet and they're asking me like, should I do that? And I'm like, you already know the answer, but
Right.
like it's so much like it's just like they already do know the answer, but they're just so influenced or triggered or whatever. Or like let's say somebody who's living in like not I don't even know how to term it anymore, a larger body, a fat body, whatever, and they're at a meal and there are people smaller than them saying how fat they are and how disgusting they are and they're like, what do they think about me,
Right.
and it's
Right.
just like I don't expect people to reject. I always say rejecting the diet mentality is something that you're going to do all throughout your 10 principles of intuitive eating, all throughout our journey, because I still am working on rejecting diet mentality. I still have to like go somewhere and think to myself, like, is that diet culture? Is that like, do I like it's a process of what's it called? It's a process of just asking yourself, like, is that in line with my value system? Or like,
Right.
for some people that some things are diet culture, for some things not. Like it's kind of very nuanced.
Right. Right. And you have to see what feels it for you. Like for
Right,
someone eating a salad can be diet culture, and for
right,
someone it doesn't have to mean that. Like
right.
it is very person specific.
Right. Exactly. So, I did like some supervision with Evelyn Tribbley, and like when I'd ask her about that principle, she's always like let's say I'm doing that with clients in session, that's like more like an unpacking principle. So like the first session or the first one or two sessions, I'm just unpacking that with them. Like, when did your diet culture start? And for some clients, it's like when they were born. They were born, for some clients, it's like their first diet when they were 5.
Oh, I know it's
Um,
so heartbreaking.
I know it is really heartbreaking. Yeah. It's really sad. That's why we're
Yeah.
doing what we're doing, right?
Yeah, I know. It's just terrible. It's like
Yeah,
you think of like a 5-year-old child, right?
I
Or like your
know.
own child, and you're like, oh, they're so happy-go-lucky, they're not thinking about it. And then like,
Yeah,
yes, you hear these stories like at 5, I recognized my body, or at 5, like I saw my mom getting on a scale and being like, oh, I can't eat this today. And it's like,
yeah,
oh, like that's so traumatizing.
I know. It really is. I mean, I always say like that a lot of clients are like, yeah, my siblings had ice cream for dessert and I had an apple, or like my parent made me walk to school, like she could have picked me up,
Right,
but she made, like it sounds like a little bit like abuse. I don't want to be
right.
dramatic, but like it feels like that.
Right. I mean, singled out in that way, yeah, like
Yeah,
it's so unfair. And like, of
right,
course, you start to develop like, what's wrong with me? Not maybe
right,
my mom is handling this not in a great way, but like, what's wrong
right,
with me as a child, right? Which
right.
leads to all these other issues.
Right. I always say this also to moms that like when you tell your child like I want you to go on a diet to lose weight, you're telling your child, I don't like you like this.
For sure.
So it's just,
Sure.
we're not trying to point fingers at parents. I'm just
No, no,
trying
no,
to,
no. We're not blaming
yeah,
at all. At all.
yeah, I'm just trying to create awareness of like that messaging, like what that messaging leads to. And
Right.
I see
Because
it,
of course parents, it comes from they love their
Right,
children.
right,
And I also just think there was no Instagram when our parents were growing up. There was no free resources. You open your
right,
phone and boom, like this is how to talk
right,
to a child. So like
right.
I think we're all learning and growing, which
Yeah.
is the point.
Right, exactly. Yes, that's true. So I feel like I always say this that like the rejecting diet mentality is like when I hear I say like their timeline, like your earliest childhood memory to how you got here, like in the
Hmm.
session. Um I want to hear it and I always feel like it informs our sessions. Like I'll go back to like session 1, session 2, but for them to hear it, they're like, "Whoa, I never realized that for the last 20 years I've been, I'm like, right. So it's interesting. And then so that's like session 1, 2-ish. Then I like to, or like if you're reading the intuitive eating book or the intuitive eating workbook. So then I like to talk about then I call this like the physical principles of intuitive eating. Honor your hunger, respect your fullness, and the satisfaction factor of food.
So this one I think is super important. So many patients will tell me, well, if I just honor my hunger, I will eat everything under the sun and I'm just going to keep going and going and going. So you're telling me I can just keep going and going and going. So if you have a client who comes in and is like, okay, listen to my hunger cues. Let's say I'm starving and I keep eating and I'm never full and I keep eating and then I want to keep eating just because I like the taste and I am full. So you're telling me I should just do that? Like, what do you, and obviously you hear the anxiety and all that.
Right,
Also,
right,
they're
right,
coming in, they're anxious. You're basically
right,
telling me to be out of control. That
right.
doesn't sound good. How do you respond to those patients?
So I don't usually like tell clients this is what you should do in
Mm-hmm.
like in a session or in between sessions. I say like this is like I teach them about the hunger fullness scale, which is a rating scale of 0 to 10, 0 being like overly starving, like think a fast day, and 10 being overly stuffed, think like Thanksgiving full, right? So, so I always say that like 0 isn't comfortable hunger, 10 is not comfortable fullness for most people, right? And again, like going back to like dieting tells you what to eat, when to eat, how much to eat. Um, Everybody experiences hunger and fullness differently at
Right,
different, right?
for
And
sure.
there's different levels of hunger, there's different levels of fullness. So,
Which I think that's so important to normalize because many people are like, well, I eat more than my boyfriend or I eat more than my husband. And like,
right,
I think it's so important to be like, and that's okay. Like,
right,
some days you're going to be more hungry than the man in the house or the
right,
woman. Like, that's okay. So I think like that's so important that you like normalize that for them.
right. It's so funny because like to me it just sounds so normal.
Right.
But for so many people it doesn't sound normal. Like, of course I shouldn't be hungry. I'm like, what does that even mean?
Right.
Shouldn't. You are.
Like, of course, I shouldn't have to go to the bathroom. I'm like, I'm
Right,
sorry, your body's going to have to go regardless of what you think
right,
or feel.
right. Like a lot of judgment. Yeah. I mean, I think that's just what diet culture does. It gets you to like question your cues, which is like again that like form of body distrust or mistrust or whatever. So so what I tell clients to do for a little bit is to set alarms on their phone for every like
Hmm.
2.5 hours, 3 hours, depends on their schedule, depends on whatever. And I say that like in the intuitive eating book, they talk about this that like when you learn to drive a car, you're hyper focused on, like checking the mirrors and like the steering wheel and everything. And then like after a while, it becomes like automatic and you don't really think about it. So I don't want them to be like hyper focused on their eating always, but I do kind of a little bit ask them to do it for let's say I'll say 1 week or 2 weeks, and that's because I want them to notice that they do have a natural hunger fullness pattern, like everyone does. Yes, diet culture and dieting may have turned that off, but we can like reinstate those cues. That's like the goal.
Right, for sure. Which I guess
Yeah,
was kind of also like what you're saying to your patients and like for the dietitian also in the initial stage of an eating disorder also it's like we're gonna prompt you to eat every couple hours
right.
until those hunger cues turn on. So interesting how like
Yeah.
similar like when your patients walk in the room and like the same for when they're at the initial stages of their eating disorder treatment.
Yeah, because even though like they like somebody with an eating disorder, their cues may be totally like you said haywire. I find that that's very similar with people who even don't have an eating disorder. It's just so confusing, so hard to listen to your body.
Right.
Um, and then yeah, so then I teach them like what is a hunger cue, right?
Okay.
So I feel like this is like people don't really talk about that. Like I didn't learn that when I was a kid. And I think like you could probably speak to this a lot that like let's say like with fullness, like a lot of people who experience fullness experience guilt. So there's been sort of like confusion of like is this fullness or is this my fullness feeling? Is this my guilty feeling? Or like hunger, right? So like hunger, you could feel hunger in your head, you could feel hunger in your hands, you could feel hunger in your stomach, like emptiness, gnawing, like an achiness in your stomach, but like that's usually like very hungry.
Right, right. That yeah, I think like especially so for those who are more in the restricted end, like any basically they're walking around on an empty stomach. So any food in their stomach initially is gonna feel full, and anything past
Right,
that is super full. So also
right,
like part of this, which I'm sure you do also, is normalizing fullness. Like
right,
that's what your stomach is meant to do. If your stomach is working properly, it will stretch out to accommodate the food and then it
right,
will digest it, and that's
right,
okay also. But I think like you said with diet culture, it's like, oh, you have to like make sure you don't go over the point of fullness. Which like sometimes life calls for being full, like
right,
you said,
right,
whether Thanksgiving or Christmas or
right.
whatever. And like that's also very okay and normal. And to be able to kind of, like you said, sit with that fullness, sit with
Mm-hmm.
that guilt, and to explore that guilt, even if you're full, it doesn't mean you have to feel guilty. You did nothing
Mm-hmm.
wrong. Like
Right,
I always tell patients, if you drink a little bit more water, you're probably going to feel full or you're feeling guilty for that. So
right.
I think that's such an interesting point that, yes, what's fullness like? Is it okay to be full? How to tolerate that fullness? How not to feel guilty? Like it's so interconnected.
Right. And also like going back to the hunger fullness scale, like there's different levels of fullness, right? So I say like let's say like 6 or 7 is like what they call like comfortable fullness versus like 8, 9 or 10, which is like a little overstuffed or very stuffed. So I say like if you're like let's say like let's just say like you have a desk job and it's like lunchtime and you're really hungry and you need like a meal and you have like let's say cholent and potato kugel and
Yum.
challah and yeah and so yummy, but you're like a 10 full, you're like really uncomfortable sitting at your desk working. But if you do the same thing on a Friday night and everybody's chilling on the couch and you're like reading a magazine and you're like a little overstuffed, that might actually feel really comfortable because you're not thinking like I want dessert. What do I have? Should I eat it? You just ate it. You enjoyed it. Your stomach feels like content, a little uncomfortable, but it's like you feel super satisfied. So there's just different
Right.
levels of sometimes you're going to want to feel this full and sometimes you're going to want to feel this full. Just like you wouldn't want to if you're about to go to like a fancy expensive restaurant, you're not going to want to like eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich because you want to be like really like hungry for your meal,
Right.
you
Right.
know?
Exactly. Yeah. Which I think that's like so important to teach because then it's like, oh, nothing with intuitive eating, like nothing is black and white, which I think the eating disorder makes things so black and white. Like there is
Right.
a spectrum. So like, yeah, if you're that starving, okay, so have like a half of a peanut butter jelly sandwich so you tame some of the hunger and then you still
Right.
have room for the delicious food. Whereas the
Right.
eating disorder is like, you cannot eat anything.
Right.
There's no way we're not eating. I don't care if I don't feel well.
Right.
I love that there's like all this flexibility with intuitive eating, which like would just set the person so much more at ease. So it's like, oh,
Right.
but I'm eating in an hour, but I'm hungry. And intuitive eating is like, okay, well, let's assess your hunger and it makes sense to eat. And that's totally okay.
Right. I think that for people who struggle with an eating disorder, flexibility seems to be very scary.
Yeah, for
And not
sure.
just someone with an eating disorder, anyone who has been dieting for a long time. Like, I mean, I'm not trying to like be a therapist here, but like we could
No,
overanalyze this.
there's a lot of overlap. So
Yeah.
don't worry.
I feel like people who do tend to diet are so badly like trying to like they're always like, just tell me what to eat and I'll eat it. And I'm like, I can't just tell you what to do and you'll do it. Like that's not how people work, right? Like you're a person in the world living with in the gray and you have choice and that's a good thing. But they want so badly almost like not to have a choice. But like that's
Right.
how they got here, you know?
Which is so interesting because it's like, I don't think, like you said, they realize when a diet tells them what to do or someone tells them what to do, initially they're like, oh, that feels really nice.
Right,
But then if the diet says to do X, Y, and Z, and now they want to do A, B, C, then they're like, oh no, this
right,
is a predicament. Because like now I'm listening to this, but I want to do this, and is A, B, C bad, and is X, Y, Z okay? And like,
right,
it
right,
doesn't make them feel not in control. But it's
right,
interesting initially. It's like, tell me what to do, tell me what to do. And then later on, they're like, now I feel really out of control because they
right.
said do X, Y, Z, and I'm doing ABC, which ABC could be totally fine too, but they didn't hear that from that person.
Which I guess creates a lot of guilt because it's like I'm supposed to be doing this. I mean, I hear that all the time from like not just clients, just like people near me. Like, I really shouldn't be eating this. Like, of course they're gonna feel guilty if that's what they're saying to themselves the whole time, you know? Like,
Right. And
how could
I
they
just
not?
had a patient actually the other day, and she's like, I don't like going to dietitians. A lot of eating disorder patients don't go to dietitians because they're the ones who are like forcing them to eat. Not really
Right,
forcing, but they know
right,
they're going to change their eating habits, which is scary. But
right,
it was interesting. She had said to me, like, well, my dietitian will say, like, okay, so allow yourself to have like 3 or 4 cookies if you want, if you're in the mood for that. And then she said, but let's say I have 5, then
right,
I'm bad. Then and I'm like, oh, but I think she meant like she gave you this like random number, but someone who takes things so seriously and they are so rigid and so fearful of what will happen if they step out of that like whatever, requirement that they're having or whatever it is, for them, she took it as like anything above that is horrible, which is like, oh,
right.
I think she just meant eat what you want, but putting an arbitrary number on it already sets off all this anxiety.
I think that I tend to tell people that people who have an eating disorder almost always have a comorbidity of a mental illness, of anxiety, depression, OCD, bipolar, because
Mm,
it's manifesting in food, right? But it's like, yeah,
for
like if
sure.
you tell me 3 or 4 cookies and I have 5, the anxiety is just out of control, you know? So it's like, yeah, that's the way eating disorders work.
And this is why also the food label, right? It's like for me, cereal, I don't know, half a cup of cereal for me is a joke. Like I need like 5 times that serving size because that's just not like it's not okay. But if you're someone like you're saying who has OCD tendencies and you're like a serving size is a half a cup, which is a joke,
Right,
you go above that half a cup and this is what's been FDA whatever, this is what
right,
the nutrition label reads, yeah, like that causes so much anxiety. So
right,
like I feel like also the intuitive eating principles, like you're saying, like really helps with that.
right, right. And it's just, I also like just to validate the experience of how hard it is. Like, not just for people with eating disorders, it's just like, it's just, it is hard because even people who are like going through it with me, like my clients are just like, oh, I don't love the flexibility because I just want to know what to do. And I hear that.
Right.
But it's like like it's a journey. It's a journey through the principles. So there's like hunger, fullness, and then satisfaction. Like you were saying before, it's hard to know, do I want something salty, sweet? So satisfaction, that's why I call it like the physical principles. Like learn about your hunger, learn about your fullness, learn what you actually want. And then after those few sessions, I say like, okay, now that you've been doing it for a little bit and you can identify, are you really hungry? Let's talk about like I talk about like self-care, challenging the food police, and not and coping with your emotions with kindness. So I always say like once you figure out what your hunger feels like, now when you want to eat and you're not hungry, we could kind of pull that apart, what's going on for you emotionally.
Right.
So I first like to talk about self-care and how if you don't have adequate self-care, physical, spiritual, emotional self-care, food could take on that role, and how dieting kind of compounds that because dieting makes food like taste better when you
Right.
actually
For
eat it.
sure.
So it's like you get that
Hmm.
more reward in your brain, and then you're just like not like eating enough, sleeping enough, moving enough, don't have enough, um, don't have good friendships, don't have boundaries in your relationships, don't have a therapist or a way to process your emotions, right? No spiritual practices. Like food is just like all those could become all those things.
Right, right, exactly. So like the eating disorder or food or like certain behaviors really do becomes like a coping skill, right?
Right,
It's your whole
right,
toolbox and it's your whole life and
right,
it's your passion. So when someone's like, okay, let's take this away, you're like, what? I
right,
built my whole life around diet culture and an eating disorder. Like, and
right,
for some people, it's hard because they've been in and out of treatment, so they don't have close ties with friends or family. They haven't been in school because they've been in and out. They don't have a degree. They can't get a job. So
right,
most people, it's so hard also because it's like, well, if I give up this, I'm gonna have nothing. Which is like, no, if you give up this, you're actually gonna have everything and all these
right,
opportunities at your feet. But for those people, it is so hard because this is what they've been doing for basically the entire life. The ones who are, thank goodness, not as emotionally like drained from it, they are able to still have relationships and go to school. And I feel like for them, it's sometimes easier to pull away. But like you're
mm-hmm,
saying, if you don't have these emotional, spiritual, whatever ties it is, it's so hard to be like, okay, I'll give it up because
mm-hmm.
this is what your whole passion and life is about.
Right. And I feel like that's important for people to know that having an eating disorder is a coping mechanism. I feel like people are just like, why would someone ever do that? Or how could it get so bad? Right. And it's like, I even said this to a client recently. I'm like, don't worry, I'm not going to take away the food yet. And I'm like, I'm never going to take away
Right.
the food from you. But like, I wonder what the food is doing for you. Because I always say, like, human behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum. So when you engage in a behavior that's hurting you, let's say, it's also somehow helping you, obviously, because you wouldn't do it.
Right.
So that's why I like to kind of like attack it from different angles and say, like, let's talk about the food directly in the beginning. I mean, I do talk about hunger, fullness, and satisfaction,
Mhm.
but before I even do the emotional eating piece, I want them to know, like, let's have other things in place. Like, how are you holding in your self care? Do you even believe in self care? Because so many people don't.
Like
Like,
self-care, that's selfish. I'm like, okay, no, no, no,
right,
no. Let's
right.
take that back.
Right, right. And I think it's becoming more like, normalized and maybe like a little bit of a fad. But I think that people don't really think of like people will just say, oh, it's my self-care, it's my self-care. I'm like, well, what like let's pull that apart more. Like what would actually really be caring for yourself here?
Right.
So
Right.
it's
There was
different.
one of the eating disorder books. I think it's Eating in the Light of the Moon.
That's
There
what
was
I was
like
just thinking. Yes.
that's so funny with the
Yeah.
log. Are you thinking about the
In the water?
yeah, with the log in
Yeah.
the water?
That's literally what I was just thinking. Yeah.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like this whole thing, there's a storm, right? And you're like resting on the log. The log is gonna save you because everything is like just drowning. So you stay on the log and it's like keeping you afloat. And then like the storm is over. And people are like, hello, like you can come back
Right.
to shore now, let go of
Right.
your log. But the log sees you. You don't let go of the log because if you let go of the log, you're gonna drown. But you don't need to drown anymore because there are people there to help save you and there are other helping coping skills. Like hanging on to this log, hanging on to eating disorder is actually gonna keep you from moving on. And if you're just sitting in a log in the middle of nowhere, like eventually it won't end well for you. But
Right.
it's so hard to let go of that comfort.
Right.
That's so funny that you were thinking about that too.
I was like, I read something in a book with something with the moon and I couldn't remember the name of the book and I couldn't remember
That's
the
so
like
funny.
so I
Yeah.
just didn't say it. But yes, I was literally thinking that. So I think about that a lot. That like I guess that's like kind of like the IFS model, like internal family systems model, that like all the coping skills that we've developed over the course of our lives have helped us at some point and are no longer helping us. So we can't just take them away. We have to unpack them and figure it out, which is like
Right.
very
And
powerful.
replace them, which is
Right.
hard. It's so
Right.
hard.
It is very hard. So that's why, so we do like, I do a lot of self-care talks. Depends on the client. Like sometimes I could stay there for weeks because I love that topic and I love helping people develop their self-care plan. And
Hmm.
it's very like important to me. And I think it's really an important thing. Um, Sometimes clients are in a, like, let's say they've been like abused. So they
Mm.
feel this level of like, I don't deserve self-care.
Right.
So sometimes we have to like come back to that when they're feeling better, like when they're doing better.
Right. And that's interesting because a lot of patients will say to me also, like, I don't deserve recovery. I don't deserve to be better. I don't deserve
Pleasure.
to enjoy the food
Right.
that I want. Right. Which
Yeah.
is like,
Yeah.
again, that's also so heartbreaking. And like
So
you said,
sad.
let's unpack that.
Right.
Why don't you deserve that? Like
Right.
let's talk about that.
Right. So, and then some people are just like, oh my God, self-care. Like, is that really a thing? Can I really do that?
Right.
And
I know it's so funny. Like it's so funny. Self-care, and this is like related but not snacks. Like adults will tell me adults don't eat snacks. I'm like, I don't know
right.
what adults are hanging out with, but like all the adults I know are like eating snacks. Like people
Hmm.
like another patient also was like, I eat so many snacks. Like, what's wrong with me? I'm like, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with the other people who are not that there's anything wrong. I mean, listen to your
Right.
hunger cues, do what you want, but like snacks are just not for children. Like
Right.
are for everyone because sometimes you're hungry between a meal or you just want something and you want to have a snack.
Right.
So I wonder also like, does that come up for you too in intuitive eating? Like we're saying like self-care, is that a thing? Snacks, is that a thing? Like how do you tackle that when that comes up?
I'm trying to think if that's ever been a thing, like specifically snacks. Um, no, I feel like people have certain things like I'll call it like food rules.
Okay, right.
So it's
That would
like
fall under that category, I guess.
yeah, or it would be like I was just talking to a client who felt like she was making peace with food, but when we unpacked it more, I was like, okay, are you like she was eating it, but she was feeling really guilty. I'm like, okay, what are your
Mm.
trigger foods? Or like what foods are you feeling like safer around? And she was like, oh, my trigger foods are like everything. Like not
Oh.
just pasta, sweet potatoes, but like anything that's like diet culture. I mean, I don't even know like anymore.
I guess like
Everything.
carbs, anything
I
carby.
I guess so. Even if it's like a vegetable, even if like some
Right.
people would say that's, but I don't know. So many people have taken that so far. So
Yeah, I
um,
know. The poor white, I always say poor white potatoes and poor
yeah,
white rice. They need to
it's
have a
true.
support group and pasta because so sad for them. So
Yeah,
demonized.
chips, candy, cake, all those things. Yes,
Hmm.
let's make a
Yeah,
support group for
so
them.
sad.
Yeah, so I just think like I wouldn't say snacks necessarily, but just I sometimes say for clients like, would you ever send your kid to school without snacks and lunch? Oh my God, I would never do that.
Right.
But you just went 8 hours without any food, and like you don't need food, like but your child, like that doesn't make any sense, right?
Right. And again, like we alluded to this last time, just like being a martyr, like, but I can handle it. Like
Right,
I'm functioning. I'm like getting through the day. And it's like
right,
you think you're functioning, you think you're
right,
getting through the day, but clearly, like, look, you showed up. You came
right,
here. Like something is
right,
bothering you. So it's
right.
not totally okay.
Right, or you're not functioning at your ideal level. Like imagine if you were eating, imagine if you weren't consumed by guilt, like you would be a different person.
Right. And they all deserve that. Again, it
Right,
goes back to the deserving piece. So
right,
I'm fine, I don't deserve it, you know. So
right. And that is what you model for your kids, by the way. The way that you care for yourself is the way that you're modeling for them to take care of themselves. So if you're thinking like I must neglect myself for my children, you're just perpetuating that
right.
belief system for your children, sadly.
Especially when
So
they're a sponge. They just
yeah,
soak up
yeah, totally,
everything for sure.
totally. Yeah, going back to that value-based living, what's my value system? That I matter, that I'm a person, that I have needs, like I want to give that over. So then we talk about challenging the food police, which I find is like
Yeah,
that CBT component, like your
yeah,
thoughts create
big
feelings, your
one.
feelings create behavior. So I talk a lot about this is like people love this, like automatic negative thoughts, you know?
Mm.
Like I was saying before, like we just absorb like our belief systems from people around us. So like you kind of have that voice in your head, that recording in your head. What does it sound like? And of course, for people who have been dieting, it's a very mean voice.
Oh yes, they are so mean, so
Yeah,
mean. I'm like,
yeah,
would you ever say this to like a loved one or a friend? And they're like, I would never. I'm
right,
like, but you can just say it. And I always say like, if you speak to yourself in like a really harsh, crappy way, you feel crappy. If you feel crappy, you treat yourself crappy, and then that just
right.
perpetuates the whole cycle over again.
Of course. So it's like yeah, just like I talk about like different automatic negative thoughts, like catastrophizing, black and white thinking, right? And I like the face it, trace it, and replace it. Like I learned that from Para Abramowitz, like quote her a lot. So like that's just like an easy way to think about it. Like you want to notice your thoughts, like be aware of what you're telling yourself all day. Like if you eat that, you're going to be fat, and if you're fat, no one's going to like you, right? So like imagine, of course, you're not going to want to eat. Like you're not going to let yourself eat chips, and at least in a calm way. You might be doing it,
Right.
but you're screaming at yourself the whole time, right? So if you're not happy with your behaviors, you have to go to the thoughts. So we talk about their thought patterns, how to reframe it, and then not using food to cope with your emotions. So it's like I feel like this is a good time for them to figure out when you are eating, not because you're hungry, what's coming up for you, and like kind of like paying attention to your like let's say emotional patterns that trigger you to
Hmm.
eat when you're not hungry or trigger you to restrict even.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, it's like a lot of times for the first part about your saying, like reframing the food police, like we end up like my patient, we end up laughing, right? Because at the end of the day, we're like, okay, so let's talk about a sweet potato. Like, what's so scary about a sweet potato? And like they start laughing, like we're laughing about it because it's
Right,
sweet potato. It's an apple. It's a banana,
right,
right? Like, oh my gosh, society has demonized bananas for so long. It's bananas are
yeah,
so much sugar. It's like bananas are fruit. Like
yeah. I love
banana has
bananas.
potassium. It's like so
Yeah,
healthy and good for you. And like add peanut butter. Oh my gosh, delicious. So like
yeah,
once you start having these conversations and they're also able to laugh about it and like someone else is validating for them that like what you're thinking in your head, like maybe it is irrational because when they don't say it and they just think it, they're like, oh, this must be true because I'm thinking it. And once they say
right,
it out loud and someone else is like, okay, let's unpack that. Like, we're
yeah,
about the sweet potato. Like, what did a sweet potato ever do to you? Like, this sweet potato beat you up? Like, the sweet potato, like, say mean things to you? And it's like, you're right. Like, why am I so scared of a food item? Like, how is it
right.
a food item, like an inanimate object? Like, I always say, pick up your pen. Is that
Mm.
scary? Like, pick up your water bottle. Is that scary? Like, a sweet potato, why are we giving this so much power? And like you said, that comes from like, well, I'm afraid it's gonna make me gain weight. Well,
Hmm.
what does that mean? And I'm afraid I won't be liked. When
Mm-hmm.
has that happened, right? It's like all these things that are seemingly are like, oh, it's just food. Like you said, once you unpack that, it's like, yes, let's get to the real underlying issue problems. And then the sweet potato is not as scary because it's less about the sweet potato and more about what's really going on
Right.
emotionally.
Right. I think that that's a really good point. That like I always say this. I heard it on a podcast. I don't remember where I heard it, but they said like you don't have to believe everything you think.
It's true.
Yeah, so like our brains really tell us a lot of things throughout the day, and just having that space either in therapy or with me or journaling or whatever, meditating, which I find to be really, really like an important life skill. Um, you're like you notice what the thought pattern is, and then you could reframe it, right? So that's why I feel like that's really, really important, like working on the thoughts. But then
Yeah.
with that principle, coping with your emotions with kindness, so I tell clients like I give them a few ideas, but like when you know you're not when you want to eat but you're not physically hungry, and only when you are positive you're not hungry, because sometimes it can be from hunger. Like let's just I always go back to like hunger fullness scale. If you're like noticing that every single night at 9 o'clock you're binging on carbs, let's look at what you ate in the day. Oh, well, I skipped carbs at lunch because carbs are obviously bad. And like I couldn't have carbs at breakfast because like they're kind of bad. So then like I don't know, but then I binged them anyways. I'm like, well, I'm not going to say this is emotional eating. I'm going to say that you probably need carbs throughout your whole day, you
Right.
know?
And like it's interesting because I've definitely had patients who are like, I don't know, whatever, I don't believe in intuitive eating. And then when we say like, okay, obviously for each food, each meal, it's good to have a carb, a protein, like, fat, making sure you're hitting that. And like a week later, she'll come back and be like, for breakfast and lunch, I had all my food groups. And then I had dinner and I actually found I didn't binge at night. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
that's great. Why
Mm-hmm.
do you think that happened? And it's like, because you're nourishing your body. It's also like,
Mm-hmm.
you don't drink water all day. I don't know if anyone's ever done this, but like somehow you're just not drinking water. Like you don't think about it. And then at night you're just chugging water because your body is like, I'm so, you don't even realize that
Mm-hmm.
like the bottle's gone because you're not
Right.
thinking. So
Right.
the same with food, if you're not nourishing yourself properly, if you're taking out food groups, if you're restricting or even mental restriction, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Of course, later on your body's like, hello, we need some food here. And then all cues are turned off. It's just food, 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 food. There's no hunger
Right.
fullness because
Right.
you're in like this mode of we need to protect ourselves.
Right. And it overlaps with like all the self-care stuff that we were talking about. Like, wait a second, like you skip breakfast and lunch? Why? I don't know. I just was really busy. Like I forgot. You can't forget about lunch. Like just like
No.
go like you're not sending your kids to school without lunch, like you're not sending yourself to life without lunch, you know?
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So
Exactly.
there's a lot of overlap. Like that's why like when we say intuitive eating, it's like no, it's not just like eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full. Um so so I just love that principle. So like coping with your emotions with kindness. So like asking yourself those two questions. What am I feeling right now? And what do I need? So like identifying the feeling and then identifying, I always say that like you can use food to cope with your emotions and sometimes it helps. And I
Mhm.
have like a lot of different,
That's also normal at times. It's normal at
right,
times to be like, oh, I could really go for like ice cream because like I'm not feeling great. Okay,
yeah,
yeah, have a scoop or two. Like
right,
that's okay. I mean, if it's teetering on a gallon, 2 gallons,
right,
obviously it's more emotional, but that
right,
is very normal.
right. So I say like you could do whatever you want, of course, and let's like create autonomy, but like does the food help you or does it not help you? Like if you're feeling like angry at your husband, I don't know if a bowl of ice cream is going to help you. I wonder if
Right.
talking to your husband about it or even journaling about it or calling a friend to discuss it. Okay, well, it's debatable if you should talk to your friends about your husband, but um not for this podcast, but
Yeah.
um but like I think that like some people will say, yeah, it actually lowers my the intensity of my feelings. Then an hour I could talk to my husband. And some people will say, no, I just feel way worse. Like I really just need to go deal with it directly. So that is
Mhm.
really figuring out your like coping strategies besides for food or with food or how it's going to work. And that it takes a level of practice and self-awareness, like what's working and what's not.
Right. And I think also like many of my patients as well with like the comorbidities, right? Anxiety, perfectionism, they want everything done yesterday. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, well, recovery, intuitive eating is a process, right? Like maybe you realize that, this amount of food is satisfying and then one day it's not and then you tweak it and then you go back to it and then you're in the mood for this and you never thought you'd have a craving for chocolate and now you do and things are changing and it's like
Mm-hmm.
they just want to know what's going to happen every single day, which the eating disorder
Right.
tells them. This is your schedule every single day.
Right.
Intuitive
Right.
eating is like, well, you're actually going to enjoy life and let's see what the day brings, which is so riveting and freeing, but for them feels so scary because they don't know what will happen.
Right.
And especially in the beginning, once they trust themselves and trust the process, then they know. But especially in the beginning, it's so hard to be like, you're giving me all this freedom. Like, wow, like,
Right.
can I even do that? And it's like, yes, you can do it. It just takes
Yeah.
time and practice.
Right. Right. Okay, so we have 6 more minutes, so I can't finish all the principles, but well,
Oh, we
maybe we'll
can
do,
continue at a
yeah,
different, yeah,
maybe we'll do what's it called? A third one.
a third one.
But basically we're only up to like the fifth, like 5 out of 10 principles, right?
Right.
So I will eventually talk about gentle nutrition and joyful movement, but I
Mm-hmm.
only do that when it comes from a place of self-care and not from a place of self-punishment. So that obviously takes like a lot of time. And like, just if this is helpful for anyone, I say this to clients all the time. I probably said it on the podcast a bunch of times, that if you've been dieting for 5, 10, 15, 20 years and you've been working on intuitive eating or eating disorder recovery for one session or 5 sessions or even a year, it's going to take a long time to unlearn what you've been telling
Very
yourself
long.
for all of those years. And I'm not going to say it's going to take you 20 years. I hope it won't. And I'm not into like that whole, like, you'll never heal. And like, you always have
Right.
to,
Right.
I don't believe in that, but like, I think that just to give yourself the grace and self-compassion, which is like almost like the whole goal of intuitive eating, is to like reframe that inner critic and that food police voice that is coming not of permissiveness. That's where probably people get stuck, of like, intuitive eating is eat whatever you want, do whatever you want,
Right.
be whatever
Right.
you want. That, I don't think that's what it is. It just,
No.
you know,
Right, for sure. And I think that's like so important to harp on is like things take time and that's okay. And it's okay to be kind to yourself. It's okay to be gentle to yourself. It doesn't mean you're gonna fly off the handle. It doesn't mean you're gonna be a couch potato. There's nothing negative of being kind to yourself, but in a world where diet culture is praised and it's like the more food rules, the better, the meaner
mm-hmm.
you are, the better. It's like,
Right. No
no,
pain,
that's
no gain. Like,
right. Like
yeah,
that's immobilizing, that's horrible, and that's so
right,
torture. Like no one has to go through that. No one
right,
deserves that.
right. That only works till it doesn't work. And that's why,
Exactly. It's not sustainable. It's just
right,
not sustainable for
right.
sure.
And it's a really sad way to live, honestly. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so thanks for coming on. We'll do it
Thanks
again.
for having me.
We'll finish the principles.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll finish for sure. Sounds
Okay.
good.
Okay, have a great day.
You too.
Okay, bye.
Bye.